Next. The word came out flat and tired, the way a word does when it has already been said 9 times before noon. Lydia Crane stood on the porch of her homestead just south of Millhaven, Idaho, a sheaf of handwritten notes pressed against her apron, and she watched the 9th man climb back onto his horse without so much as a thank you. He hadn't even waited for her to finish her last question. She supposed the look on her face had answered it for him. She turned back to the door. The October wind came down off the ridgeline and found every gap in the porch boards, and she pulled her shawl tighter and looked out at the fields her husband had broken from sod 5 years ago and left her with 3 years ago, when his heart simply stopped between one row and the next. 40 acres of good bottomland and a house with 2 rooms and a root cellar, and no man to work it through winter, and no money to hire one either, which was precisely why she had placed the advertisement in the Millhaven Courier 6 days ago. Wanted, a capable man of honest character to work a 40-acre farm through winter and spring. Room and board provided, small wage, prospective arrangements negotiable. That last line had been Ruth Adler's idea. Ruth ran the post office and had seen more arrangements come out of the Courier's classified column than any preacher in the county. Prospective arrangements, she'd said, tapping the word with one finger. That way a man knows there might be more than wages, without you having to say it plain. Lydia had not intended marriage when she placed the advertisement. She had intended to survive the winter. But 9 men had come and gone in a single morning, and not one of them had felt right. The first had smelled of whiskey before 8 o'clock. The second had looked at the house the way a man looks at something he means to own. The third had not looked at her at all. The others she was already beginning to blur together in her memory. She went inside. Her daughter Clara was at the kitchen table, 7 years old and precise about it, arranging dried beans into patterns only she understood.
"How many more?"
Clara asked without looking up. "None today," Lydia said. Clara looked up then. "What about the one standing by the fence?" Lydia went to the window. There was a man at the fence. He had not knocked. He had not called out. He was simply standing at the post and rail that marked the yard from the field road, hat in his hand, looking at the ground the way a man looks at it when he is deciding whether the ground is worth his trouble. Lydia watched him for a moment. Then she opened the door. "The position's been posted," she called across the yard. He raised his head. He was somewhere in his middle 30s, lean without being thin, with the kind of face that weather had worked on honestly. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I saw the notice. I've spoken to 9 men today." "I heard." That stopped her. "You heard." "Millhaven's not a large town," he said. It was not an apology. It was simply a fact. Clara appeared at Lydia's elbow, as she had a way of doing without making any sound. She looked at the man by the fence. The man looked back at her with the same careful attention he had given the ground. "He can come in," Clara said. Lydia looked down at her daughter. Clara was not a child who spoke carelessly, and she was not a child who warmed to strangers. In 3 years of widowhood, she had submitted to exactly 2 visitors' attempts to win her over, and both of those had been women who brought pie. "Come up to the porch," Lydia said. He latched the gate behind him when he came through it. She noticed that. His name was Owen Hale. He had come down from the Bitterroot country after 2 seasons of timber work and 1 bad winter that had cost him 3 fingers of the left hand. The middle 3 he showed her, matter of fact, tucking the hand back in his pocket when she'd seen. He had worked cattle, grain, and timber. He did not drink. He could read and write. He had no family in the territory, and no debts he was aware of. "Why no family?" Lydia asked. "Had some," Owen said. "Wife passed in 89. No children." "I'm sorry." "Yes," he said. That was all. She consulted her notes, though she'd written most of them about the previous 9 men, and they were no longer useful. "The room is off the kitchen," she said. "Small. The wage is $4 a month. I keep a kitchen garden and 6 laying hens. There's a milk cow named of Pearl who is manageable if you don't startle her. The work is what you'd expect: repairs, field prep, firewood, and anything else the season demands." "What does the position end?" "End? When does the arrangement conclude?" She had not entirely worked this out. "Spring planting," she said, "unless other terms are agreed." Owen turned his hat over once in his hands. He looked at the fields, then at the house, then at Clara, who was still standing beside her mother, watching him. "The child eats first," he said. Lydia blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Whatever is in the house, the child eats first. That's my condition." It was such a plain thing to say that for a moment Lydia could not find an answer for it. She looked at Clara. Clara was looking at Owen with the expression she reserved for things she had already decided about. "Agreed," Lydia said. She put out her hand and he shook it. And that was how Owen Hale came to work the Crane farm in the autumn of 1892. He moved his single bag into the room off the kitchen that evening. Lydia heard him through the wall, the quiet set-down of the bag, the creak of the cot, one long silence that might have been a man sitting and thinking, or a man already asleep. She could not tell which, and she told herself it did not matter. What she had not admitted in the advertisement, and what she did not intend to admit to Owen Hale, or to anyone else in Millhaven if she could help it, was the real state of the farm's finances. The 40 acres were hers outright. She had made certain of that in the first terrible months after Daniel died. But the roof on the barn needed work before the first hard snow. The west fence line had given way in 2 places over summer, and the root cellar held enough to see them through to January if she was careful. After January, she was less certain. $4 a month would cost her more than she could comfortably spend. She had calculated it 3 ways before placing the advertisement, and 3 ways it came out the same: thin. But thin was survivable. What was not survivable was another winter alone, with 40 acres she could not maintain, and a child who needed feeding. She stood at the kitchen window the morning after Owen arrived, and watched him move through the yard in the gray November light. He had risen before her. She had not heard him, which was unsettling for a woman who had spent 3 years sleeping lightly, and he had already found the woodpile and was splitting kindling with a steadiness that suggested he had assessed the stack the night before and arrived at a plan. He worked without looking toward the house. That was something she had not expected. The second man she'd interviewed had had the habit of glancing toward a window every few minutes, as though waiting to be noticed. Owen Hale split wood the way a man solves a problem, completely and without an audience. Clara was watching him too, from the window seat with her knees tucked up and her chin on her hands. "He's tidy," Clara said. "You can't tell that from watching a man split wood." "His boots are clean," Clara said. "He cleaned them before he came out." Lydia looked. The boots were clean. She poured the oatmeal and said nothing. By the end of the first week, Owen had repaired the 2 fence lines, assessed the barn roof and named his materials, and built a rough corral extension that Pearl the cow immediately approved of by walking into it without being led. He reported to Lydia each evening before supper, not at length but with precision, telling her what had been done and what remained and in what order he proposed to address it. She began to keep a second set of notes. He ate what she cooked without complaint. He cleared his own dishes. When Clara left a rag doll on the kitchen floor, he stepped around it rather than moving it, and that was the moment, though Lydia did not register it as a moment until much later, that some tight and watchful part of her began to ease. Millhaven noticed, of course. Millhaven always noticed. By the second week, Dora Prentice at the dry goods store had asked Lydia directly whether she was keeping company with the new man, and by the third week, There were opinions in the church pew behind hers about the propriety of a widow housing a male employee in a room off the kitchen. Reverend Albright approached her after service on the third Sunday and did it gently, which she appreciated, though not enough to change anything. He was a decent man who believed that most problems were solved by bringing them into the light. "There is talk, Lydia," he said. "You understand I'm not the source of it." "I understand," she said. "A formal arrangement might—" "I'll think on it," she said, and smiled in the way that meant the conversation was finished. She did not tell Owen about the talk. She drove home in the wagon and made supper and listened to Clara tell Owen about a bird she had seen from the schoolhouse window, a cedar waxwing, she was fairly certain, and Owen said he'd seen them sometimes in the Bitterroot, in the berry season, and Clara said she had not known that, and would he tell her more? And Lydia stood at the stove and was, for one unguarded moment, simply glad. She buried it quickly. Gladness was not part of the arrangement. The snow came in the first week of December, which was earlier than usual and harder. It did not come gently, the way the first snow sometimes does, with small flakes and a hush over everything. It came sideways off the ridge with a wind behind it that had been building since morning, and by the time Lydia had realized what was happening, it was already covering the yard in earnest. Owen was in the barn securing the animals when the worst of it hit. Lydia watched from the kitchen window as the light disappeared by degrees, the distance between the house and the barn shrinking to gray, and then to white, and then to a whiteness that had no edges. Clara had her face pressed to the glass. "He'll come back," she said. It was not quite a question. "He'll come back," Lydia said, and heard herself say it with a certainty she was still earning. He came back 20 minutes later, moving steadily through the drifts, head down. He knocked the snow off his boots at the door, she heard that clearly, and came inside, and his face was red from the cold and he had ice in his collar. "Pearl's settled," he said. "Chickens are in. I've blocked the gap under the big door with the spare feed sacks, so the draft won't get through." "Sit down," Lydia said. "I'll get you something hot." She had said it before she considered whether it was the sort of thing she ought to say, and she stood at the stove with her back to him, and ladled soup with slightly more attention than the soup required. "Mrs. Crane," Owen said after a moment. "Lydia," she said. There was a small quiet. "Lydia," he said. He said it the way a man says a word he has been holding at a careful distance and has just decided to set down. "The town is talking." "I know." "I won't pretend I didn't expect it." "No," she said. "Neither will I." She turned around. He was sitting at the table with his hands wrapped around the mug she had set in front of him, and he was looking at her with the same attention he gave everything, complete and without performance. "I'm not asking anything of you," he said. "You should know that. The arrangement is the arrangement. But if the talk is causing you trouble, I can make other sleeping arrangements. Sleep in the barn through winter. I've done worse." "You won't sleep in the barn," she said. "Then what would you like to do about it?" She set down the soup ladle. She had thought about this for 3 weeks without arriving anywhere she was comfortable, and she found now that she was tired of arriving nowhere. "Reverend Albright suggested a formal arrangement," she said. Owen did not move. "Define formal." "A marriage," she said it plainly, "in name, for the purposes of propriety and the farm, and Clara's." She stopped. "I'm not speaking of anything else. I want to be clear about that." "Clear as spring water," Owen said. "It would change nothing practical. The arrangement remains the arrangement. Your wage, your room, the work. It simply," she searched for the word Ruth Adler would have used, "regularizes things." Owen looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up at her. "You're not the first woman to put that sort of proposal to me," he said. That caught her off guard. "No?" My first wife proposed to me, he said. I was too shy to do it myself. A very small, very genuine thing crossed his face. I'll accept your terms, Lydia. On one condition. You and your conditions. Just the one this time. If it ever becomes something other than a name, if something changes, you'll say so, and I'll say so. No pretending in either direction. She looked at him for a long moment. He was serious. He was entirely serious. This man who had walked through a blizzard and blocked the gap under the barn door with feed sacks and never once looked toward the window to see if she was watching, he was asking her to promise him honesty.
Agreed,
she said, the same word she had used at the fence. He put out his hand and she shook it, and the second bargain was struck by firelight while the snow came down outside, and Clara slept in the room upstairs, unknowing. They were married on a Tuesday in December, 10 days before Christmas, in Reverend Albright's parlor with Ruth Adler and her husband as witnesses. It lasted 11 minutes. Owen wore his good shirt, which she had not known he possessed until that morning. Lydia wore the blue dress she had last worn to Daniel's funeral, and had told herself she would not wear again. But it was the best thing she owned, and she was not going to stand in a reverend's parlor in her everyday gray. When Reverend Albright said the words, and Owen said, "I do," and Lydia said, "I do," it was a plain and unadorned thing, like the closing of a gate latch, functional, and not without its own small sound. Owen did not kiss her. She had not expected him to. He signed the document and she signed it, and Ruth hugged her and whispered something in her ear that Lydia smiled at and did not repeat. They drove home in the wagon. The snow had gone hard and the road was clear and cold, and Clara sat between them under the lap robe and talked about the waxwing bird again, and asked Owen if he thought there were cedar waxwings in the Bitterroot in winter, and Owen said he did not think so, that they moved south for the berries, but that there were other birds worth watching for. Like what? Clara said. Like the Clark's nutcracker, Owen said. Gray and black, loud, doesn't much care who's watching. Clara considered this. I'd like to see one. Come spring, I'll show you where to look. Lydia looked straight ahead at the road. Come spring. He had said it as though spring were already decided, as though staying were already decided. She did not say anything, but she noticed. The new year came in cold and kept its word. January was the kind of month that pressed itself against windows and found the places where the chinking had worked loose, and there were mornings when Lydia woke to frost on the inside of the bedroom wall, and the particular silence that meant the temperature had dropped in the night without mercy. Owen was up before the cold every morning. She stopped thinking of it as surprising. He built the fire and brought in wood and saw to the animals, and by the time Lydia came to the kitchen there was coffee on and the room had some warmth in it, and she had begun to depend on that warmth in a way that disturbed her less than it once had. He was building something in the evenings. She had heard the sounds from the main room for a week before she asked, a particular rhythm of measuring and planing and the occasional quiet knock of a mallet. A shelf, Owen said, when she stood in the doorway and looked at the pieces laid out on the floor. For the books, Clara's been keeping them stacked on the floor by the window and the cold's going to warp them. Clara had 14 books, which was more books than most children in Millhaven, and was a source of some private pride for Lydia, who had traded canned goods for several of them. That's considerate, she said. It's a shelf, Owen said, which was not an argument, just a correction. He finished it on a Thursday evening and mounted it to the wall between the two windows, and Clara arranged her books on it with the ceremony of a person entrusted with something important. She put the biggest ones on the bottom and the smallest on top, and then she stood back and looked at it and said, "It needs one more book." "We'll get one," Owen said. He said it to Clara, but Lydia was standing there, and the wee landed somewhere in her chest and sat there quietly, the way a useful thing does. January passed. February came with its own cruelties. A man from the Territorial Land Office arrived at the farm on a Tuesday afternoon in the third week of February, and he was polite in the way that a man with papers is polite when he believes the papers will say everything that needs saying. His name was Hargrove, and he represented a company out of Boise that had been purchasing bottomland claims throughout the valley, and the name of the company was on a card he placed on Lydia's kitchen table with a precise and practiced hand. "Mrs. Crane," he said. He had not yet been informed that the name was now Mrs. Hale. "This offer is fair market value. More than fair, I'd say, given current rates." Lydia looked at the paper. She did not touch it. "We've had our eye on the bottomland in this section for some months," Hargrove continued. "The company is prepared to move quickly. I have authority to execute the purchase today if you're inclined." "I'm not inclined," Lydia said. Hargrove smiled the smile of a man who has heard that before. "Mrs. Crane, a woman alone." "Mrs. Hale," Owen said. He had come in from outside without either of them hearing. He stood in the doorway with his coat still on and his hat in his hand, and he was looking at Hargrove with no particular expression, which was, Lydia had come to understand, the most serious expression Owen Hale possessed. Hargrove turned. He took in Owen's size, and the missing fingers, and the steadiness, and made some quick calculation. "Mr. Hale," he said, "I wasn't aware." "We married in December," Owen said. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "The claim is filed under both names now. I'd encourage you to check the county record before you come out here again with papers." Hargrove's pleasant manner did not exactly collapse, but it rearranged itself. "The offer stands," he said. "Open-ended." "The land's not for sale," Lydia said. Hargrove gathered his papers and his card from the table. Lydia had still not touched either, and put on his hat and went out. Owen stood at the window and watched the buggy move down the road until it disappeared past the tree line. "He'll be back," Owen said. "I know," Lydia said. "I'll write to the county clerk this week. Get the joint filing confirmed in writing." He turned from the window. There was a look on his face she couldn't name, something between concern and something else. "Your land is your land, Lydia. I want to be clear about that." "Owen." She said his name the way he had said hers the night of the blizzard, putting it down. "I know whose land it is, and I know whose help I'm glad of." It was the first time she had used the word glad out loud in connection with him. She was aware of it the moment it left her mouth. He was aware of it too. She could see that. But he did not make anything of it. He simply nodded and went to hang up his coat, and came back and sat at the table, and she poured him coffee, and neither of them mentioned the word again that evening. But she noticed that it had been said. The shelf grew to hold 16 books by mid-March. Owen had found 2 more at the trading post in exchange for a day's work on the post owner's fence, and he had brought them home wrapped in paper and set them on Clara's shelf without ceremony, and Clara had added them to the arrangement with great deliberation. The bigger one on the bottom tier. The smaller one, a book of illustrated birds of the American West, on the 3rd shelf up, where she could reach it easily. She carried the bird book to the kitchen table that evening and put it open in front of Owen and pointed to the Clark's nutcracker. "You were right," she said. "Gray and black." "Usually am, about birds," Owen said. "Come spring you said you'd show me where to look." "Come spring," he said. "I will." Clara looked at Lydia with the particular look she had, the one that held more than a 7-year-old was supposed to hold, and then she looked back at her book. Lydia went to the window. The yard was showing the first thin lines of melt, the snow drawing back from the fence posts, the ground beneath beginning to remember what it was. The fields would need turning in 6 weeks. There was seed to arrange for, and the roof repair they had gotten through winter on a prayer. She was thinking about the fields and the seed and the money she had carefully set aside through January and February, and she was thinking about none of those things at all, and she knew it. She turned back to the room. Owen was tracing a line in the bird book with his shortened left hand, following a flight path diagram, and Clara was watching his hand and not the diagram, her small face entirely open. He said something about the mountains and the berries and the birds that traded between them, and Clara said, "Oh," and the lamp threw a warm light across the table. Something loosened in Lydia's chest, not the careful, managed easing of the past months. Something larger, something she had been holding at arm's length since December and had not been able to name, and could name now. She pulled out the chair and sat down. Not at the stove, not at the counter, at the table, beside them, with her hands folded on the wood and the lamp between them, and she said, "Tell me about the mountains." Owen looked up. He looked at her, the full, careful attention of the man at the fence, the man in the blizzard, the man who had built a shelf for 14 books and said we as easily as breathing. "The bitter roots," he said. He closed the bird book gently so as not to lose the page. "In autumn they go every shade there is. Some mornings you'd think the whole range was on fire. But the fires don't burn you, they're cold fires, the cold kind." He paused. "I'd like to show you sometime, both of you. Both of you." There it was again, the we of it, the both. Lydia looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked up. "Owen," she said, "something has changed." She said it simply, the way he had asked her to, no pretending in either direction. The second condition of the second bargain, kept. He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp burned between them. Clara had gone very still in the way of a child who understands more than she is meant to. "Yes," Owen said, "I know. I thought I should say so. I'm glad you did." He put his hand on the table, the left hand, the one with the missing fingers, and opened it, and Lydia set her hand in his, and it was the third time they had joined hands at this table, and it was nothing like the other 2 times and entirely like them. "Come spring," Clara said, very quietly, to no one in particular, the way a child says a thing she has been certain of for a long time. "Are we going to the mountains?" Owen looked at Lydia. Lydia looked at Owen. "Yes," they said, and meant more by it than mountains. The roots that hold a home are not the ones you can see. You will hear stories of deeds and dollars, of water rights and county filings, and those things matter. Anyone who has faced a man with papers at the kitchen table knows they matter. But what truly roots a home is smaller than that. It is a shelf built for a child's books. It is coffee already made when the cold is worst. It is a hand on a table in lamplight, freely given, freely taken. Lydia Crane had set out to survive a winter, and what she found was a man who asked only for honesty in return for everything he gave. Owen Hale had come to a fence with his hat in his hand, and what he found was a woman who meant every word she said and kept every promise she made. The bargain they struck in the yard became a life. That is how it happens sometimes, not with grand declarations, but with latched gates and clean boots and a simple grace at table. Now, if this story reminded you of the kind of plain, honest love that holds through any winter, tell me down below, what is the smallest act that ever made you feel truly at home? Share it with us. Every answer matters. And if you'd like more journeys like this one through the old frontier, subscribe and stay close. There are more stories where this one came from. Good night. God bless you and the ones you keep warm.